You're here in the stillness. Near me, I sense holy sweetness, calling my soul. Oh, it's restless and running my soul. Oh, it's restless till I find my rest in thee.
Well, welcome. I am Justin McIntosh. I am the rector of St. Paul's Ivy, a church in the Charlottesville area, and we are here for our fifth session to discuss a secular age and how we live as Christians in that secular age. And I'm joined with Nick once again. Nick, would you introduce yourself?
Sure. So I'm Father Nick. I'm the priest and pastor of the Fort Church of St. Martin's Parish in Doswell, Virginia. And I've really been enjoying these conversations, Justin. And I'm glad that we've decided to extend it. It was just going to be 4, but now we're on number 5. This is the final discussion, right?
Yes.
Yeah. We've been on this little pilgrimage, being Christian in a secular age, and now we're going to finally kind of focus more. We've really spent a lot of time on the secular age aspect and what that means and how did we get where we are, and really trying to unpack that. And now we're going to, I think, look a little bit more at the being Christian part. All of that's been implicit and we've brought it up from time to time, but now we're going to, I think, focus a bit more on that being Christian
Right.
in a secular age, as we've redefined, in a sense, and we'll talk more about this, as we've redefined what it means for us to be in a secular age. Just what is this secular? And so we've decided to call this session or this discussion Another Kind of Secular, Glimpses of Transcendence. Another way of thinking about this also, though, is kind of reawakening to a sacramental cosmos, an invitation to reawaken to and see again that this is a sacramental cosmos, or God's own good creation, and that there is room in the secular age to do that. And the sources we're going to draw on, I think, a lot today. We'll still draw on Charles Taylor, of course. I mean, Charles Taylor's The Secular Age has been the main work that we've appealed to. And kind of along with that is James K. Smith's How Not to Be Secular, which is kind of a guide to reading Charles Taylor's A Secular Age. But we've also pulled in other sources along the way to help us in our exploration and our conversation and in our pilgrimage. Among those have been, for example, David Bentley Hart, who I think we'll be appealing to a little bit today also. But in addition to Hart, a movement, you might say, within theology known as Radical Orthodoxy will be informing part of our discussion. This is principally the work of John Milbank, theologian in the Church of England named John Milbank, lay theologian, as well as the work of another lay theologian in the Church of England named Catherine Pickstock. And among Milbank's work are Theology and Social Theory, Being Reconciled. These are books that we'll be drawing on, as well as collections of essays under the title of Radical Orthodoxy or Radical Orthodoxy Reader. And Catherine Pickstock's work that we've already in some sense appealed to a little bit. And that the book in particular that I'm thinking of is After Writing on the Liturgical Consummation of Philosophy. And so again, we just say these sources up front so that we don't have to keep referring to them as we're having our conversation, that these are the sources that we're drawing on as we're having this conversation. But what I want to do, Justin, is reach back a little bit to the last video and pick up where we left off, which was with this story of disenchantment, this myth of disenchantment. And one of the things that we tried to argue there is that this is what Taylor would call, even though he doesn't call it this is what Taylor might call a subtraction story and a story of maturation. So that often when you hear people who are agnostics or more commonly atheists in our current contemporary culture, if you ask them about how they became atheists, they usually have a story that they tell about how they used to believe, or they grew up in a household where it was just kind of assumed that you believed in God or had some kind of faith. Perhaps their family wasn't particularly religious, although in some cases they'll say that they were. And then they grew up, they read some books, they started thinking critically and thinking as an adult, as a mature and rational adult. And this is how they set aside their naive faith, or the naive faith of their family, and embraced a more honest, a more mature outlook on life that doesn't need some kind of parental figure in the sky, some kind of God that keeps them as little children, but they've grown up. And we saw that especially in that clip from the interview of Bishop John Shelby Small. Yeah. I mean, he who does not claim to be an atheist. I find it very hard to pin down exactly what he does believe. He doesn't claim to be an atheist, right? And he talks a lot about God, but he definitely has incorporated and made his own this subtraction story, this story of maturation, of growing up. We don't need a God who keeps us as children. We need to grow up and embrace a more rational faith. But also, he'll say a more mystical faith. You feel a kind of tension there, or at least I do, in the way that he uses those words. But another story. Go ahead.
Right. I was just saying, and in this story, which really has taken hold, at least in elite circles in the Western world over the last couple hundred years, you also find, and I'm thinking here of, say, Sigmund Freud's Future of an Illusion, you find this idea of we need God because we're scared and afraid of things in the world that we can't control, or we're afraid of facing death or something like that. So that it's really about the childish fears and overcoming those childish fears. And what's remarkable is that you hear these same sorts of ideas all the time today, but they are ideas that go back well into the 19th century and before, and they're very much part of that maturation story, which is critical to the secular age.
Yeah, I wonder, when I was an undergraduate, I had a professor in the religious studies department who had done a lot of work on and published a book on conversion experiences and stories of conversion. And of course, she looked at religious examples of this.
Right.
So she found religious believers and collected their accounts of their conversions and studied those. I would be interested if someone has, and if they haven't, maybe someone should go out and do a similar kind of study of the atheist conversion stories. And because I think Charles Taylor is right that they follow this certain pattern, in the same way that, say, especially Christian religious conversion stories follow the pattern that you see set out first by St. Paul in the New Testament, his quote unquote conversion, though that might be not a great word for that, since it's not as if he in his own mind left Judaism to become Christian. Right, those categories like that didn't quite exist.
Right.
But that does become kind of the model. And then of course Augustine becomes one of the other early models for conversion, his own conversion. And so their conversions become a kind of template for Christian conversion stories down through the ages. And I wonder if maybe a study of these atheist conversion stories, if a template can be found also that they seem to follow, because I think Charles Taylor is right in saying that they do seem to share the same subtraction story, maturation story kind of aspect to them. And then have a study look critically at that and to what extent that actually corresponds with what has happened.
You know, and speaking of story, Nick, I'd say we've spent a lot of time over the last couple of sessions deconstructing the stories that you hear in our secular age. And one of the things we want to do today in making space for a sacramental cosmos is also kind of point to some specific historical events, I think, that really did shape the way that modern people thought about God and about theology and so forth. We haven't really highlighted those things, but we are going to try to do that today because we need to kind of push back on them in some ways to recover a sacramental cosmos, or to develop a sacramental cosmos in our secular age.
Yeah, that's right. And along those lines, I want to take just a moment before we jump right into that to correct something that I said in the last video that maybe nobody noticed, but it bothered me.
You had an error, Nick?
So I was reaching kind of off the top of my head for an historical example of when in the quote unquote wars of religions, Protestants and Catholics worked together against a common, and I said the Schmalkaldic League worked with the Habsburg, and actually that's precisely wrong, right? The Habsburgs were Catholic, the Schmalkaldic League Protestant, but the Schmalkaldic League was formed to resist the power and influence of the Holy Roman Emperor, and to do that, this Protestant Schmalkaldic League worked with the monarch, the King of France, who was Catholic, to undermine the Habsburgs. So I left out one player in that and therefore made the wrong connection. I wanted to correct that before we go on.
All right, very good.
So the point is still made, though, that the wars of religion were not along simply Catholic versus Protestant lines.
Right.
But yeah, let's jump into what you were alluding to, which is if this story of disenchantment is in some sense a myth that we tell, a story we tell to enchant ourselves, to kind of spellbind ourselves so that we believe something about the world that isn't true, namely that we live in a disenchanted world. So we have to keep telling this story to ourselves over and over again to weave this enchantment around us, that we now look out at the world and see a disenchanted world. What has actually changed? Because something's changed. Yeah. Taylor's right about that. Something has definitely changed between, say, the time before around 1500 and then this time after 1500, the modern era, as we've been calling it.
Right.
And I think maybe one of the best ways to understand what's changed is the end of Christendom. So this relationship of the church with the state, but also the sense of developing a kind of Christian culture that is the culture of the realm. Medieval England is a Christian realm, for example. And you see that, for example, in the stories even there in the 15th century, like Mallory's L'Amour d'Arthur, where these stories speak of this kind of golden age under King Arthur as being a time of the height of Christian virtue and chivalry among knights. But even in the Christianization of older poems like Beowulf, for example, trying to create a kind of Christian ethos and culture for Europe in particular. The end of that, which in some ways we're still in the death throes of, but also a change, a philosophical or theological change in the way that we think about God. So that this might be, and this is the argument of radical orthodoxy, this is the aspect of that unthought, that constellation of ideas, that exists beneath our master narratives, creating the conditions of belief and the social imaginary in which those master narratives make sense. This might be the one thing that gets lifted up first into consciousness, you might say, and begins to drag the rest of those constellations of unthought beliefs or assumptions about the world up into public consciousness, where they begin to be critiqued, and especially so at the time of the Reformation. And what I'm referring to in particular is a move from the theological height of the Middle Ages, which we might identify with the work of St. Thomas Aquinas, who was a Dominican, and a kind of Franciscan reaction to that was not always directly in response to Thomas, but in some ways created an alternative account. And that alternative account is, at least if we follow the narrative, the story, the argument put forward by folks like John Milbank, is what began to create the conditions for our modern social imaginary.
Right.
And so if we go back to Thomas Aquinas and his view of God, one of the big questions you have to ask when you're dealing with questions of God is the relationship of metaphysics to language. These two go together. In other words, can you talk about being as such? And the difference, for example, if there is a difference between what it means to say, I exist, Justin exists, Justin's cup of coffee exists, it has being, and God exists. And we've mentioned that in the modern era, we're much more interested in the question, the epistemological question. How do I know what I know? And how do I know what I know is true? Right. But before the modern era, the dominant question was not the epistemological question, but the ontological question, the question of being, what exists. Only when you have laid out, what truly exists and how it exists, can you then approach from the, say, medieval or even ancient mindset, the question of how do I know about it? How do I have knowledge about what exists? And we have flipped it around and said, well, you can't really know anything exists, right? Until you've determined the question, how do I know what I know? And each starting point, whether you start with the ontological question or you start with the epistemological question, it has its own challenges. I'm of the opinion that the best way to start is the ontological and then move to the epistemological. I think the challenges that arise from starting with the epistemological question are ultimately challenges that won't allow you to move forward. How do I know what I know is already presuming that there's an I that's doing the knowing, and then you get caught in this vicious circle and you end up, for example, with Descartes, well, I know that I exist because I'm the one who's doing the knowing, right? The cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am.
Although interestingly, right, one of the critiques of that is that Descartes tries to move from an epistemological claim to an ontological claim, and it may be that that move is not warranted, right? So even if you try to start with yourself, right, with the buffered self looking out at the world, you may not even be able to move from just consciousness and thinking and epistemology into actual being. That may not even be a possibility, and so we're kind of left with very little if that's where we start.
Right, and that's what I was referring to about the kind of insurmountable obstacles of starting with epistemology. So that even the most committed to the scientific methodology scientist, and the scientific methodology is just an epistemic or epistemological method, right?
Right.
Has to assume that there's a reality out there that the methodology is,
Right.
helpful in discerning and discovering and explaining, and to assume that there's a reality out there and that there's a knower that can know about it is already to have made metaphysical commitments or ontological commitments. So in a sense, there really is no way of getting back before ontology to epistemology. I promise I won't keep using those words.
Well, no, it's fine. I think it's good. It's good to be precise about it. So in a way, then we're all making ontological claims, even if we think we're not, as you're saying. And then what's going on here in the late Middle Ages is a change in ontology, right? That ends up having a profound impact on how we think about God. So what was the ontology that Thomas put forward?
There was a debate, in a sense, in the Christian tradition about whether God was comprehensible. And if you think about that word, you think of like a prehensile tail as a tail that wraps around. So comprehensible is that you can actually wrap your mind around God. There were two positions, obviously, yes and no, right? Yay or nay. The no is attributed to a Christian thinker, a Neoplatonic Christian thinker called Dionysius the Areopagite, or sometimes now called Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, because it's not actually Dionysius the Areopagite from the book of Acts. That's the name that's attached. He said no. He said the human intellect as a created intellect, it will never be able to comprehend the vision of God, the beatific vision, not even in depth. The other position is that of St. Augustine. And Augustine held that, well, not in this life, but after death, the human mind will be able to comprehend God. Well, this left Thomas in a bit of a quandary because he was very influenced by both Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite and St. Augustine. Both of them show up all over, say, the Summa Theologia. Who would he go with? And related to this is, again, this question of language, because knowledge is always, for us, connected to language.
Yeah.
Knowledge and rationality that's the way that we are knowing things and rational creatures is through language.
Right.
So those who tended to side with Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite would tend to hold up what is known as apophatic or the via negativa theology. That is, I can't make positive claims about God, but I can say what God is not.
Right.
And
I can't say God is good or God is love or God is merciful. I can only say, in some sense, God is not good, right? Good as we understand it in our human sense.
Yeah, I mean, some of the traditional attributes of God are, in fact, put in this way. Traditionally, God is spoken of in Christian theology as immutable. That means God's not mutable. God does not change. God is spoken of as impassible. That means that God is not passible, or God does not suffer emotions, emotional turnings. Even to speak of God's eternity, God is eternal, is not to speak of a duration of time, a never-ending duration in either direction. That would be to speak of God being everlasting. But to speak of God as eternal, which is traditionally how Christian theology speaks of God, is to speak of God as not being bound by the category of time. God is not a time-bound creature like we are.
Right.
So these are all, these attributes, these divine attributes that you often hear are essentially attributes in the apophatic tradition, saying God is not. And even to an extent, saying God is omnipotent, say all-powerful, or God is omniscient, all-knowing, is, again, to just say God is not limited by his power is not limited in any way, or his knowledge is not limited in any way. God's not limited by these categories. So even in a sense, those attributes are apophatic in a sense.
Right, right.
But someone who does believe that God, at least in some way, is comprehensible, will also tend to say that there are things that we can say about God. And Augustine says a lot about God.
Right.
He's what, one of the most, if not the most, prolific authors of antiquity, or at least late antiquity. I mean, we just have tons of writings from Augustine, and there are tons of writings that we know about that we don't have anymore, right? I mean, he just wrote and he wrote and he wrote, and much of it about God. Well, Thomas wanted to say there are things that we can say positively about God. Yes, there are some things that we say through the via negativa or apophatically.
Right.
But there are cataphatic things. There are things that we actually want to say positively about God, and we can do it. But he doesn't do it by saying that's because we comprehend God's being, or we will ever comprehend God's being. He's with Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite in this. We cannot comprehend God's being, but we can know it, he says, by analogy. So Justin exists, and Justin's coffee cup, or Justin's coffee exists. But in a sense, there's even a difference in what we mean when we say Justin exists and Justin's coffee exists, right? Justin is a living creature. You as a living creature you have a different kind of existence, and yet there is some analogy between the two. There's an even more radical break, Thomas will say, between the existence of any creaturely thing, anything in creation or creation itself, and God, to the extent that we cannot comprehend God's being. And yet we can say that God exists, and we can speak in that way analogically, knowing that the being of creaturely things, or the created order, is in a sense a shadow of the divine being,
right.
And has its existence by way of participation, or by way of God's own gifting of his being to the things that exist. And I know
we could say that something is maybe then we could say something is good in the world to the extent that it participates in the goodness of God. We haven't comprehended goodness, right? But you can see then that there is this kind of connection between the creator and the created order, and that the very meaning and significance of the created order is found in the creator, right? In participation in the creator.
That's absolutely right. And so, sometimes you'll hear people speak of the great chain of being, and oftentimes this is misunderstood to think that God is the top link of the chain, right? That's not quite the way it is, right? God transcends the chain of being, and therefore God is equally present to each rung of the chain of being, and yet the whole chain of being subsists in the gift of being that God gives from his own inexhaustible and necessary being, which I know is very abstract, but
it is. But I think one of the ways we can really grasp this, comprehend it, if you will, is to try to visualize this image. So, one way that we tend to think about God, especially when we use words like transcendent, is a kind of spatial hierarchy, right? And we almost, this is our intuitive sense, right? That God is sort of somehow above us, higher than us, beyond us. And it creates a sense of distance. And it also makes it feel as though the things of this world don't participate in God, right? That they're separate from God. And really what we're talking about here is more that language that Paul uses in Acts of, in God we live and move and have our being. it's the sense that God is around, and I'm using visual imagery here, but around, beneath, through, about all that is. This coffee cup, right? In all of its qualities, whether it's its whiteness or its shape or its firmness, is existing and being sustained in God, right? And that's what transcendence means, right? That it participates in this kind of Platonic reality, if you will. That's a vision of God, if we're trying to imagine it, of a God who is everywhere and in and through all things, but to be very precise, not the same thing as the created order, right? We're not talking about pantheism here, because I think that's the era we might slip into and we start revisualizing here. But a God that is sustaining every blade of grass that we walk on. And this, Nick, I think is a very radical way of thinking about God in our own time. I do not think this is how most people visualize God. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But we're far from Thomas's view of God in many ways. Our instinctual cultural intuition about this is far from God, from Thomas, excuse me. And there's a certain recovery of intimacy and closeness with God in Thomas's view. And so I think if you visualize it that way, you can begin to feel more what you're saying in very abstract terms, but you can feel it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And in fact, I think it's that attempt to use spatial metaphors that might trip us up. And this goes back to something we mentioned in previous videos about the modern era or the secular age as being one in which things are spatialized.
Yes.
And that spatialization is, that's what trips us up in a sense, because then, this is often how I find even modern professional theologians speaking of transcendence in a spatialized way. So transcendence means God is up or out or somewhere other than his creation. And maybe the first time I came across this was when I was a teenager, and I read Bishop Spong's book, This Hebrew Lord. And he actually has a diagram where he's got, it's not super complicated or artistic. He's just got, his vision of what he thinks traditional Christianity is saying about God is, here's a circle over here, and that's creation, and here's a circle over here not connected to it, and that's God, and every now and then God has to make an intervention into the creation. That is a view that will come about, and we're going to talk about how that comes about. That's not what Thomas is saying, right? But also Thomas is not saying pantheism, and there's a new word that sometimes, a neologism that gets thrown around called panentheism. But the problem with that word, and I know a lot of people really like it, panentheism, everything's in God, is that it continues to tempt us into a spatial metaphor where God is somehow something extended in some sort of space and creation is within God.
Right.
And I just think, well, maybe that's better than saying pantheism, but it, it's still going to trip you up because you're still thinking in these spatial metaphors.
Part of the problem is, of course, that's how we think as humans, in spatial metaphors and models, right? And that's one of the biggest parts of our brain is our spatial cortex, visual spatial cortex. So that's part of the challenge I think we have, but it's worth remembering that when we use these models, we're always speaking in an inadequate way, right? And what we mean by God is being itself and outside. Again, I'm using a spatial metaphor, but how else do you do it, right? Connected, but not identical with the created order. And that's the very difficult language to try to use. But I think it gets us closer to a better conception of God.
Yeah, that's right. It is difficult, I think, to think about things in non-spatial ways. When I'm talking about the soul, sometimes I'll give this example, and it's talking about the soul and talking about consciousness and how they might be related and that kind of thing. I'll sometimes give the example of, I ask the person I'm talking to think of something, say a red apple. And then I ask them, okay, so you visualize this apple, you turn it around, you see all of its parts, you see the stem, so on. Now, where is that apple? And I often get the reply, well, it's in here, right? And then someone will point to their head. Well, no, I mean, if I were a mad scientist and I strapped you down to a table and gave you a lobotomy right now, if I cut open your head, I wouldn't find the apple, right? Well, the apple's not in my head, it's in my mind. Okay, well, where is your mind? And again, well, it's up here. Well, no, hold on. As you start to think about it, the thought of the apple exists, but it doesn't exist in a physical space.
It doesn't exist in the brain. I mean,
it doesn't exist in the brain. You might say, if you want to be a strict materialist without yet having the proof for it, you might say that it's reducible to certain brain functions, the firing of certain synapses. That's fine, but in that case, you're still not talking about the apple that you're thinking of.
Yeah.
Right. Then you just have to explain away that the apple that you're thinking of doesn't exist in any sense whatsoever, and the you that's doing the thinking doesn't exist in any sense whatsoever, and so on. None of this language means anything, which gets us back to this question of how language is connected to being.
Right.
Christ says, when he's speaking to the woman at the well, that we Jews, this is what Christ says, worship God on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, and you Samaritans worship God on Mount Gerizim. But God is spirit, and the true worshipers worship in spirit and truth.
So really thinking hard about the spatial and temporal categories and how they shape God and our conception of God, I should say. And that's the thing that we maybe don't do enough of in modernity. One of the interesting things I think we could say too about this, Nick, is you find then in our conception of God transcendence, but you do also find a radical particularity, right, in the incarnation. So there's a highly spatialized and temporalized dimension to our faith, but then also this transcendent dimension. That's an interesting sort of paradox of the Christian religion. But certainly when we're thinking about our conception of God and our doctrine of God, Thomas is making some very important points here.
That's right. I mean, some modern theologians will sometimes make a distinction between God, the transcendence of God. The transcendence of God is out there, not involved. This is the God who's separate from creation. And then the immanence of God, this is God actively involved in the world and that kind of thing. As if
we're saying this binary is terrible.
Right. Transcendence just means that God both transcends all of the categories of creation and is therefore equally present to every aspect of creation, that there's no way of getting away from God. That's what transcendence means. All things that exist, because in this view, being and the good are interchangeable. They are transcendentals that are in some sense just other names for God. That all things that exist, that positively exist, are therefore good, and they are good, and they exist again as a kind of shadow of the true good and the true existence, or the true being that just is God. And their existence and their goodness they're not complete or perfect as it is in God, insofar as they are sustained by God, by the gift of grace, essentially. They have an analogical relationship to God himself.
Yeah, and this, I mean, again, we're going to sort of use spatial metaphors, but there's sort of a thickness to this kind of conception of reality, right? And we've talked about this in previous videos. Our current secular age conception is a very flat universe in which everything can be reduced in some sense to the physical. You can reduce, for instance, consciousness or the experience of thinking of an apple to physical processes. And what this is saying is a more Platonic metaphysics, which is not maybe as dominant in how people in our society think today, but certainly was through much of Western history, which sees a kind of, I like the imagery of layers and thickness to it, the sense of connection between all of these parts and that they're integrated in each other. And there is such a thing as greater reality, which is an interesting concept to wrap your mind around. But that this world can be real, but there can be an even more real reality that this world is a part of and connected to. I think there's a great image of this, frankly, in C.S. Lewis's book of The Great Divorce. I've always been struck by that imagery when people are they're sort of on the edge of the kingdom of God and about to encounter that edge, and they're trying to walk on the grass there, and the grass is like, they can't walk on it because it's sort of more real than they are, And that's an interesting way of thinking about ourselves, that we're shadowy, that we're less substantial, less real than God. And that's I think there's something really beautiful and powerful about that. But that, again, that is sort of countercultural, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, it's shot through all of Lewis's work. And C.S. Lewis was a medievalist, and so
right.
He holds to these views. I mean,
Right.
It permeates his work, and it's no coincidence that the play and later the two movies based on the play. I think actually the first movie came out first, then they made a play, and then they made a movie based on the play. So there's a play based on a movie, and then a movie based on a play, and they're all called Shadowlands. And it's about our life here, right? This is about C.S. Lewis, particularly towards in the latter part of his life. But Shadowlands describes our pilgrimage through this world. That there is in fact something more real that is underneath, that is supporting and sustaining this created world that we live in, and we're heading towards that in our pilgrimage.
And for those, for whom this may be a new way of thinking and visualizing God, it might be worthwhile just to read up a little bit on Plato's allegory of the cave, which can be an accessible way into this kind of thinking. This is such a key part of Plato's metaphysics. But he has, in the Republic, a really interesting reflection and imagining about how to enter into this way of thinking through the allegory of the cave. So if it's new to you, Google allegory of the cave and read about it.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think we should probably, I mean, I could keep talking about this.
Sure.
Well,
so what happens? I think we've laid out the ontology of Thomas, right? What changes, and who brings about that change?
Sure. So one of the terms the church refers to the great theologians, especially of the medieval period, as the doctors of the church. So the great theologians or thinkers of the church in antiquity are the fathers and the mothers of the church, the patristics. The great thinkers and theologians of the medieval period are often referred to as the doctors of the church. Thomas Aquinas has gotten several different designations, though I think the one that shows up the most is that he is the angelic doctor, that his work has reached the level of the angels. It's reached the heights of the angels. But there was a Franciscan thinker who came along not too much later, named John Duns Scotus. Now remember, Thomas Aquinas was a Dominican, and John Duns Scotus was a Franciscan theologian known as the subtle doctor. So Thomas is the angelic doctor, John Duns Scotus is the subtle doctor, because he could really get into an issue and really pick it apart. I mean, if anybody deserves that description of the scholastic theologians as those who try and determine how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, it is
Right.
John Duns Scotus. That's the kind of work he would really get in.
Hair
And
splitting,
yeah, very much hair splitting. And he thought that you if you're gonna talk positively about God, there's got to be at least one term, and he's really just talking about language at this point. He says there's got to be one word that can be used univocally of both created things and God. That this word is an umbrella term and it can be used for both, and we mean the same thing when we say it for both. And for him, the word is being. God exists, and therefore God has being. We exist, therefore we have being. Being is the one word that we can use univocally. And he still thinks, of course, I mean, it's not like he's denying that God is the creator and sustainer of all things and all that kind of stuff. He's just saying if we're going to say something about God that's true, and it's not just along the via negativa, we're not just saying what God isn't, then what we, it has to be grounded in one thing that we can say univocally of God, and that's being.
Now, Nick, just to be clear about this, it seems like one significant change here that we want to highlight is that it appears as though the linguistic category of being or of existence has kind of become, in some sense, supreme, right? It has become the category in which you place both the creator and the creation. Whereas, just to be clear, right, we were saying about Thomas's view that being is another way of saying God, in a sense, right? It's not a category outside of God. But once you start having a linguistic category that both God and the created order fit in, it's almost as though, again, thinking in spatial metaphors, you've put something above God. Is that a fair way of summarizing that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right. And I mean, I don't know how much. I mean, Duns Scotus was a smart guy, so it seems to me he would recognize that the implication of this that there would be ontological or metaphysical implications of this change in this question of language.
Yeah.
I don't know how much he recognized that, but this is what makes for him, this is what makes for Radical Orthodoxy, makes him the villain of the story in a sense.
Yeah.
It's probably putting too much on him, on Duns Scotus to consider him a villain in a sense, but it does change, as you're pointing out. It changes once you think that this word being can somehow encapsulate both God and creation. Then it does change our conception of God, particularly as you move towards this language of spatialization, which we'll get back to in a minute.
Yeah.
As you're saying, in a sense, Neo God really is just the link at the top of the chain.
Right.
Neo God is, you might say, the supreme being, right? We are lesser beings. He is the supreme being.
Right.
This is what the philosopher Martin Heidegger would call ontotheology, although Heidegger mistakenly associated this with Thomas Aquinas. But this makes God the greatest, the biggest, the most powerful, and indeed still omnipotent actor,
right,
or agent. But now God is a competing agent,
right,
with the agents of creation. This is something you've brought up several times in our videos. Now, when God does something, there has to be room for him to do it within creation. And when in Thomas's conception, if God does something, God is never in competition with the other actors or agents within creation. In fact, you couldn't do anything without God first being in Thomas's language, the first mover, the prime mover that makes your actions possible.
Right. I mean, at any moment too, right?
That's right.
But and you can see, I think we'll pull the thread here for people. once you see God and the created order, or let's say the natural world, as in some sense part of the same category of being, and therefore in causal competition with each other, it's very easy to see how God will get displaced as the natural philosophers, that is to say, what we'll call the scientists later, as they give accounts of the natural world that make no reference to God and don't need God in those accounts, right? From a naturalistic point of view, you simply push God out. And then you get a scenario where some people respond to this by saying, well, actually, God has to be working in this natural process because you can't explain it naturalistically, right? What's sometimes known as God of the gaps, right? And you will hear many, many sort of non-believing scientists who have bought into certain philosophical narratives make this point, that what science has done is continue to push God out of the picture, right? Less and less space for God. But that entire way of thinking, this is the key point that we want you all to get, that entire way of thinking is premised on a misconception of God, right? That is so dominant in our culture and in our society, and maybe in some sense can be traced to Duns Scotus, somebody who did not intend, as Nick is saying, did not intend these results, but this is the natural consequence of, in a sense, pitting God with science.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, and that's a great way of kind of unpacking what this means. That's the situation, and it takes time for this to develop. It's not as if Duns Scotus wrote what he wrote, and then all of a sudden it takes centuries to develop, and this is what has developed, is our view. As you mentioned, the God of the gaps requires you to have a view of God as an actor and agent within creation, in competition with the rest of the agents in creation. Whereas, again, for Thomas, God is never simply a physical cause in the way that we use the word cause. And I don't think we should get into this now, but Thomas has a much more robust idea of causation than we do. God is not, you'll never say, I mean, it just doesn't even make sense to call God, say, the intelligent designer in the way that we use that word now, right? He does believe that creation is ordered by the mind of God, but it's such a different notion for Thomas.
It's not as though like God, intervened,
right,
in the, say, evolutionary process to make the flagellum, right, on some microorganism or whatever, and which is what basically ID or intelligent design, some version of that. Notice how that is God as simply another agent in the world. I mean, even if you say God is outside of the created order, the way that you're talking about God as a causal agent is as a kind of scientific or physical cause. What you see is that so many of the debates and supposed contradictions and conflicts, the conflict hypothesis about science and religion, it almost becomes a non-issue. Maybe that's too strong of a way of putting it. I mean, because there are some ways in which these things connect, of course, and maybe are in conflict sometimes. But much of the areas in which we say that there's a conflict, or we read about it in the newspaper and the media, suddenly makes no sense at all. It's simply not an issue. And it's, again, premised on a doctrine of God that we think is not adequate.
Yeah, I mean, one good example of how this affects us still is we all seem to have inherited and just assume David Hume's idea of miracles. What is a miracle? A suspension in the laws of physics, right? I mean, we've all just assumed that that's what it is. That's a way of understanding, quote unquote, miracles that's only possible after Duns Scotus.
Right. Because a Thomistic understanding of miracles is that everything that exists is miraculous in some sense, if you mean it by participating in God. I mean, the miraculous is the most ordinary thing imaginable in that sense, right?
Right. Yeah, that's right. I mean, everything in some sense is suffused with the power of God, and it's worth noting, by the way, that Scripture itself does not have a concept of miracle the way Hume and we have a concept of miracle. Scripture speaks of signs, semia, and the Greek, and deeds of power, dunamos. And God will sometimes do deeds of power, or he'll do signs, but these are not necessarily suspensions of physics, right?
Right.
Sometimes they're described in those ways, but that's not, Scripture itself has no concept of a miracle as specifically a suspension of the laws of physics. That's just not the perspective of Scripture. It's not the perspective of the church fathers. It's not the perspective of the medieval doctors up through Thomas Aquinas. It's a perspective that can only come once God becomes an actor, an agent in creation.
And one way that this is playing out right now is what people say about the vaccinations, right? Some people will say, I trust that God will take care of me, and I'm not going to rely on vaccines or scientific discoveries or technologies or whatever. And that whole way of framing it is a mistake, right? Because in what we're saying here, anything that's happening medically is in some sense from God. Truly, right?
All good things. All good things.
All good things are from God, right? Yeah. So, that whole sort of distinction that plays out in our public discourse around science and medical technology and so forth that influences our public debate, that also is rooted in this sort of misconception of God. So the implications of this, Nick, I think are just absolutely profound. And, we are led astray when we, when we visualize God in the terms that Duns Scotus has offered. And it might be helpful to trace out some of the implications of that in a variety of areas, how this has played out over the last couple hundred years.
Yeah, I want to pick up on this idea about medicine and health, because I think it's a great way of seeing it. Because one of the places where we hear people talk about miracles is, let's say someone and love has cancer,
right?
And before they even start treatment, they go in and they get scans, and suddenly the cancer's in remission, and that happens, right? I mean, that really does happen. Maybe you've been praying for them, maybe you haven't, but people have unexpected remissions of cancer. Sometimes it even goes away, right? And some people don't. Some people have to suffer through chemotherapy and radiation, and that drives the cancer back. Right. I think what we're tempted post Duns Scotus, what we're tempted to do is to say the kind of spontaneous remission of cancer is the work of God. It's the miracle.
Right.
And the remission that comes through the knowledge and skill and work of the physician, of the radiologist, of the oncologist, that's human work. Right. Has brought sent the cancer into remission. The spontaneous remission of the cancer, that's God's work. That's what we're saying is wrong. Right. That's what comes in the wake of Duns Scotus. Right. A better way to see it, in the way that we're suggesting that you would find if you take Thomas Aquinas's view seriously, is that both the spontaneous remission and the remission that comes through the work of the skill and work of the radiologist and the oncologist, both of those are the work of God. Both of those are examples of God's love, of God's grace, and of God's power. And that God might use one way and might use another way is kind of irrelevant in saying, is this from God? All good things, as the Epistle of James says, all good gifts come from the Father of lights. And you can say both of them are blessings. You can call both of them miracles.
Right.
And it's not as if you're using that term incorrectly. That's what we're trying to suggest.
Such an important point, Nick, I think.
Well, one of the consequences of making God a being, even the supreme being in the universe, as Duns Scotus's univocity of being does, as opposed to Thomas Aquinas's analogy of being. One consequence of this is that God's will becomes more important than any other attribute of God.
Right.
That's not true, for example, first of all of God's attributes are interchangeable. God is one. And so no one attribute is somehow greater than the other. And in fact, in God himself, the distinctions between God's attributes, which we need to, because we are in the Shadowlands, we make distinctions between God's attributes. Truth, goodness, these are two separate things. But in God, they're one. Same with God's intellect and God's will. For Thomas, God's intellect and God's will have to be the same thing. And so you can't speak of God's will as somehow overpowering or ordering God's intellect. What this means is, for Thomas, some of the old things that you might hear said, like, can God make a square circle? Thomas would say, well, no, but not because that's a limit on God's omnipotence, making it not omnipotent anymore, but because a square circle is unintelligible. It's illogical. It doesn't make sense.
Right.
You can put those words together, but they don't refer to anything. Right. After Duns Scotus, and I think Duns Scotus would agree with Thomas on that, but after Duns Scotus, when God becomes an agent in creation as the supreme being, acting in creation as the supreme being in competition with other actors or agents in creation, God's will becomes the most important thing about God. And God can now will whatever God wants. So if God wanted to will a square circle, sure, God can do it, because his will is the most important thing, right? That's what it means for him to be the supreme being, is that his will is greater and can accomplish whatever it wants. Where we find this perhaps most forcefully expressed is in the Reformed theology of John Calvin, where it's referred to as God's sovereignty. And this brings up the euthyphro problem that Plato dealt with, which is something good because the gods or God has deemed that it's good, or is it good and therefore, the gods love it, or God, it
good in and of itself.
Right.
Yeah. Platonic sense. Yeah.
And for Thomas, it's very clear, because the good is another name for God or an attribute of God, that the good is an actual reality. And God can't simply, by his will, declare something that's not good, good.
Right.
But by the time you get to John Calvin, God can declare something that's not good to be good, and that's what makes it good.
And so there's some really interesting consequences from this for revelation, right? And how we think about the knowledge of God. For Thomas, murder, for instance, is sinful. It just is. It can't not be, right? That is the nature of murder. But you could say, under a Calvinistic framework, that if God revealed that murder was God's will, then by definition, murder, it was now good, would now be good. And so this very much changes how we think about, and here's some of the implications of it, right? How we think about what it means to live a moral life and to live a God-centered life. It can potentially create a kind of atomism too, where, like, Christians can say, well, this is what God has told us is good and bad. And you may have other religions which have different frameworks of good and bad. And how do you, in some sense, even have a conversation between those two groups of people? Whereas in a Thomistic framework, you can say, well, they're all speaking about the good, right? And I think this plays out in a variety of ways in church debates and in our society too. When the church wants to speak a word to the world about what's going on what grounds does it make its speech? And does that speech have any intelligibility to people outside of the church?
Yeah, great points. Well, one of the things that happens is that Duns Scotus's univocity of being, which makes God not it kind of, in some sense, draws God into creation. That's certainly not his intention. It's not his point, but it makes God part of the order of being, not the source of the order of being. So that God becomes a supreme being, the great being, but yet part of the, in a sense, the furniture of the cosmos, one more actor or agent in the cosmos. What this lays the groundwork for is the work of yet another Franciscan theologian who comes along a little later, William of Ockham. William of Ockham is probably best known for what's called Occam's razor.
I got one for you.
What do you got?
Occam's razor. You've ever heard of it?
Occam's razor. It sounds like some slasher movie.
No, Occam's razor. It's a basic scientific principle. And it says, all things being equal, the simplest explanation tends to be the right one.
Makes sense to me.
And this is sometimes brought up by scientists and sometimes by philosophers, usually now to simply mean the law of parsimony. The most parsimonious answer is the best answer. In other words, the simplest answer to any question tends to be the best, the one that needs the least amount of assumptions or presuppositions or arguments to get where it needs to go. That's the best response or answer to any question.
Why are you guys jumping to such ridiculous conclusions? Haven't you ever heard of Occam's razor? The simplest explanation is probably the correct one. So what?
That's not exactly what Occam, of course, didn't articulate a principle that's called Occam's razor, they named after himself, right? But it's based off of his work, which Occam did want to cut out some of the kind of extraneous in his mind metaphysical assumptions or ontological categories. You know, if I can go back to Duns Scotus for just a second, one of the things that Scotus does in his hair splitting is that he keeps adding more and more ontological categories, more categories of being to the conception that, say, Thomas Aquinas would have had, or that was just kind of floating in the air at the time, that he would have found in Peter Lombard's sentences. So to give a really quick example, Thomas Aquinas believed that each human person is a body formed by a soul, and all of the life and powers of the person are granted it by virtue of being formed by its soul, by a rational soul. That means that the soul is both the principle of life and the form of the body and all of the origin of its faculties, of its skills and faculties. Duns Scotus, being the kind of hair splitter that he is, made a distinction between the soul of a person, the soul that gives life, and the form of the body. So all of a sudden now human beings are a tripartite amalgamation. Their bodies, their souls, and the form of the body. These are three separate things. He created all new categories like hexaity and so on. We don't need to get into all of that, though I'd be happy to talk about it on Wednesday night if you're interested. The point is, in his hair splitting, and it's not just him, others did this too. They kept adding categories of things to existence. And William of Ockham came along and said, I really don't think we need all this stuff, and we can cut it out. And one of the ways that he did this, and in my perspective, and I think this is a perspective of the Radical Orthodoxy group, is that he kind of threw the baby out with the bathwater, or the baptismal water, if you will. He just started using that razor to cut out everything. And he did this by picking up on an idea that predated him, but he really becomes the great champion of it and puts it forward. And it really has become the view that we all share now, that we're taught to take, which is nominalism. Again, this is the relationship of the question of being or ontology with the question of our language. For Thomas, there is a clear connection, even for Duns Scotus. There's a clear connection between what exists and what we say about it. If our language is good and true, then it is connected to, it participates in a sense in the things that it's describing. This is not true for William of Ockham and his nominalism. William of Ockham will say that we simply apply names to things that we think are similar. So again, for someone like Thomas, there is a reality known as trees, and every tree is an instantiation of this reality, whether it's an oak or a pine. For William of Ockham, for the nominalism that he put forward, tree is a word that we apply to oaks and pines because they're similar enough that we think we can cover their existence with one word. In other words, there's a radical detaching of language from being itself. Language doesn't describe some essential category. Words don't describe essential categories, things that exist, so much as they are symbols by which we organize ideas. And there's a great little book by Etienne Jusson where it's called Methodical Realism. And it's a little book to try and convince you, or to help you to become a realist in your language rather than a nominalist. And at the end of it, he says, one thing you need to recognize is that we're all realists naturally, and we have to be taught not to do that. Again, this is like the subtraction stories. We have to be taught that our language doesn't actually refer to real things. And so this is, again, made possible by Scotus's move. And it's this move here, this nominalism, that in a sense says that it's the means by which you get what Charles Taylor will call the excarnation that comes at the Reformation. The reformers are all influenced, the great reformers of the Reformation are all influenced by Renaissance humanism, and Renaissance humanism is influenced by this idea of nominalism. So that, again, language can become detached from reality itself and just becomes a means by which we organize ideas in our head. There's so much more I could say about it, but I think I'm gonna leave it there because we have so much to cover. I want to move then to this idea of the consequences of this voluntarist God who's a supreme being that we get from Duns Scotus, and this nominalism we get from William of Ockham. Just to say, what are a couple of consequences of this? One is that sacraments, which are traditionally means of grace by which we actually receive God's grace, so that when you're baptized in a traditional sacramental account, you actually die and are raised with Christ. You are made a member, participatory in Christ's body. This is not just metaphor for the medieval church, or I say it shouldn't even be for the church today or for the ancient church. This is a description, a metaphysical description of what's happening.
Right.
when you receive the body and blood of, or when you receive the bread and wine of the Eucharist, you are receiving the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. We can set aside the question of, are the metaphysical mechanics those described in the term transubstantiation? That's an issue that can be debated. But for example, Luther wasn't interested in those metaphysical mechanics, but he was fiercely committed to this conception of sacraments, so that this realist conception, so that you truly receive the body and blood of Christ in the bread and wine of the Eucharist, the real presence. Yeah. I mean, not just real presence. I mean, Luther would say the corporeal presence, right? Because real presence has now come, even at that time, it was a little bit of a fuzzy word, right?
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah.
So if you want to look at this, look up the Marburg Colloquy, where Luther debates the real presence in the Eucharist with Ulrich Zwingli, who's the father of the Reformed tradition. Zwingli is the one who says, no, it's just a memorial meal. Christ is really present in your mind by faith, in your heart and in your mind by faith, but Christ is not present in these material things, this bread and wine in any way. And Luther says, no, you've detached language from reality. When Christ says, this is my body, this is my blood, that means that this is his body and this is his blood. That's a realist perspective Luther is taking, as opposed to Zwingli, who wants to say, Christ means that this signifies my body. This signifies my blood. In other words, this is a debate between a realist, Luther, who typically is not seen as being someone who's on the side of Thomas Aquinas, but here they are together because they're realists in their language. A debate between a realist and a nominalist in this question. So sacraments just become ordinances. Why do we do them? Because God wills that we do them, right? Christ told us we're ordered to do them. Another example, and we've talked a lot about this, so we don't have to spend a whole lot of time on it, is that there's no more good magic. There's still bad magic in the world. There's still active evil in the world, but there's no more good magic left to counter it. And I mentioned this in last Wednesday's discussion, or maybe it was the Wednesday before that, that at the end of The Exorcist, after watching her daughter be possessed and all this kind of stuff, and I believe it's in both the movie and the book, but I can't remember if I'm remembering it from the movie or the book, but I think it's in both. The mother is asked by a priest, not the main priest in the book for obvious reasons, but is asked by a priest whether she now believes in God, and she says no. She believes in the devil because her daughter has been possessed, but she doesn't believe in, she's not sure about God. She's sure about the devil. That's kind of the situation we find ourselves in because of this, because there's no more that chain of being. And, and other parts of the unthought now have been raised up in question. We've mentioned this before about ghosts were traditionally thought of as being souls in purgatory that God allowed to visit the living to warn them about, you've gotten rid of purgatory. Ghosts just become demonic activity. But there's also another part of this, which is that with no more good magic means that the only way for you to counter the evil or the bad magic in the world, the demonic activity or witches or whatever, you no longer have the good magic to do it. So all you have left is the law and torture. And that's precisely what we see with the witch trials that happened in 16th and 17th century, 15th, 16th, 17th century. So, if you look at, for example, the Salem witch trials, the Native American slave Tituba tries to, when the girls who are afflicted first start showing their afflictions, she tries to use good magic to counteract it and creates these things called witch cakes and has them eat them as a way of counteracting it. But the witch cakes are rejected by the minister Samuel Parris and the judges in the trials as being just more witchcraft. And it's just more bad magic, and therefore Tituba must be a witch too, right? And what is the only thing that they can do in response to that? Well, they can torture you and they can put you to death according to the law. Right? That's the only way to counteract, because you no longer have, you've rejected, for example, witch cakes or whatever, the good magic. And I'm not trying to say that we need to go back to believing things that might seem incredible to us now. We can talk about that later. But this is a situation where the reason why we see the violence in the early modern period that we don't see in the medieval period is because now there aren't, again, this good magic. There's not even sacraments and sacramentals left to counter the evil at work in the world from this perspective. But evil or bad magic still is seen as present. Well, all right.
And that's excarnation, just to summarize, because if you think about incarnation as, God taking flesh, entering into the world, in a sense, we're taking the sacramental, we're taking the divine, we're taking good magic out of the world in this conception of things.
Yeah, I mean, I know we can't dwell on this. I know I've got to hurry up, but a really great way of seeing this kind of how all of this kind of works is Duns Scotus's Univocity of Being, Occam's nominalism, how it comes together in the excarnation, this view that evacuates creation of God.
Yeah.
A good way of seeing this is really looking at the question of the Eucharist, because one of the arguments against Christ's presence, real presence in the Eucharist, is particularly Christ's corporeal, real presence in the Eucharist, is that, well, Christ is up next to God. And you see this, by the way, by Calvinists all the time. Christ has ascended into heaven. He's up with God. There's that spatialization. So how can he be present at all these different churches, on all these different altars on Sunday morning? Right? How can he be in two places at once? That doesn't make sense, right? That's the kind of spatialization. God needs to act in creation in the same way that agents act in creation. All of that is informing this view.
Right.
That, again, a view from the analogy of being held by Thomas, none of that even makes sense. Those aren't even good arguments.
Right.
Well, anyway, I do want to go ahead and wrap this part up so we can talk about being Christian in a secular age. So what I want to say is that this voluntarist God as an agent in the cosmos, this comes to be seen as the interventionist God, again, that interventionist theism, or the other option, because most of us don't see God actively tinkering with the universe, right? We don't see these miracles that we talk about very often. And we have good reason to wonder, why didn't God intervene in the Holocaust or something like that? So, and there have been, of course, other tragedies in human history that you can ask that. So another view that comes up as another possibility in the wake of Duns Scotus and William of Ockham is that of providential deism. And we've mentioned this before. This is a non-intervening God who establishes the cosmos and establishes it according to laws. Some of these are natural laws and some of these are moral laws. And they're really, in a sense, from this perspective, of a piece. And this is what makes it providential, because if you resist the natural laws, it's not going to work out well for you. And here I think of like Wile E. Coyote, chasing the Roadrunner, and he runs off the cliff, and then he looks down and he realizes there's no cliff underneath him anymore. He's just standing on air, and of course then the law of gravity kicks in and he falls down, right? That's resisting the natural law, and it's not going to work out for you. If you try and resist gravity, you're going to hurt yourself, or you might even die. Well, this is also the view by providential deists of resisting the moral law. God has a moral law that's inscribed in the universe also, and you can resist it, but if you resist it, it's going to cause problems for you or for your society or whatever. And for me, I always think of Jefferson and the quote from Notes on Virginia, where he says that something like, I tremble for my country when I remember. He's speaking about the relationship between white America and enslaved African Americans. And he says, I tremble for my country when I remember that God is just. Right. And he, in that section, he predicts, in a sense, the Civil War, right? Because he is convinced that there is a moral law, and slavery goes against the moral law. And as long as America is, or Virginia, or whatever country he has in mind when he's saying that, is, maybe he just means Monticello, but as long as that moral law is resisted, it's going to come to bad ends for those who resist it. Yeah. And of course, he did resist it for the rest of his life, but that moral law that he himself identified, but he had this belief, and it's off, the providential deists often had a view of the afterlife too. So it's not just that this is something that might happen in this life, but they did tend to.
There would be a judgment at the end, depending on how you follow them all.
Yeah. So, and then the flip side of this, living according to the natural law is living, this will produce physical health and wellness. And so you see a lot of this. There's a whole section in Charles Taylor's The Secular Age, which I don't think we need to get into, where he talks about medicalization and this idea of trying to create these, healthy individuals, society trying to, by having us live according to natural law, but also according to moral law. That's what creates mental and spiritual health and well-being or wellness, is to live according to the moral law. And you see stuff like this in kind of extreme examples in like Christian Science and that kind of stuff. But also in the kind of self-help books that dominate bookstores still, and so on. Well, I know that's been kind of a real quick run through of that, and I wish we could say more, but we have limited time. The problem with providential deism is that it quickly devolves into just deism. God just set this thing up and it's going, and maybe God didn't even set down particular moral laws or anything like that. Maybe we can rise up and change the physical laws, the laws of nature. And once you get to that point, once God is not only separate from just another being, even though he's a supreme being, but now he's separate from creation. He just set it up and it goes along on its own. And if he's not intervening, well, there's really no point in having the quote unquote God hypothesis at all. Right. I mean, he's just an extraneous idea that doesn't add anything to how you live your life, how you view the world, how the world works. Right. And that point, maybe you still believe, but it's just a sentimental thing.
Right.
And I think that's what gives rise to modern atheism. Not as if there hasn't been atheism in the past, but this is modern atheism.
So Nick, then could we say that part of what's going on here is God becomes so irrelevant to everyday life and to how you conceive of things, how you make your way through the world, that you simply aren't interested in the God question.
Right.
I would say at the end of the day, there's probably no greater question for human beings, and we all wrestle with it in the sense that we all have to come to an understanding of it, even if we don't realize it, we have to come to an understanding. But you can get into the habit of thinking this simply is not relevant to my life. Right. And then once you're at that stage, then it's like, I don't even think about God. And right. And in some ways, that's where it seems to me, most atheists are today. It's not as though they've thought deeply about this and come to decide that, no, they don't believe in God and so forth, that they've struggled with that question. It's just not, it's not interesting or important or relevant to them. They don't even see the value of it.
That's right.
And in a sense, it all stems from the conception of God that going back to Scotus, right? Duns Scotus.
That's right. That's right. And once you have that kind of God, you may as well use Occam's razor to cut him out, right? Because I mean, it's just an extraneous idea that adds nothing to your conception of reality. Yeah, and I think that is the view behind, as you're saying, a lot of modern atheism, where there's not even at this point, it's not even a question to be engaged. It's not even
Right.
worth the time of engaging the question, right? There's no evidence for God, so why would I even?
Right.
Whereas, again, for someone who is, for Thomas Aquinas, or someone who believes that God is actively sustaining creation at every moment of its
Right.
existence, that everything is suffused with the grandeur of God, and that it's all by the generous gift or donation of being that God, who is the necessary being, bestows on all things at all times, then, for someone like that, to look outside and see a tree with its branches stretched up is to see a creature in praise of its creator, basking in the grace that God has bestowed on it.
Right.
But for someone who sees God as just an actor or an agent in creation, they say, well, I mean, I guess if you want to say God created that tree, you can do so, but it's just a tree.
Yeah. What a dramatic mindset difference, and really how you look at reality. Reality, again, can have a certain sort of coldness and abstraction and flatness to it, or reality can have a deep richness to it, a grace suffused richness. Pretty big difference.
Yeah. And so, I mean, if you think about, if we go back to our map, our map of the secular age, or the secular world, you begin to think about maps again, and you say, well, it's just the nature of a map to be flattened, and to try and spatialize everything without a sense of the gift that comes to us through the experience of time unfolding. And maps are inevitably framed by a border. What if, though, we don't live in a map? I mean, what if, in fact, we live in a reality and not just a mental construct, flattened mental construct of that we've created out of words?
Right.
What if reality really is this obdurate, thick, teeming, lively thing that we are a part of and in the midst of? And I think that's kind of the situation that we find ourselves in. And so on the one hand, we feel this cross pressure, as Taylor would say it, between this map that we have and then the reality that doesn't fit with the map, that seems to just keep breaking in and creating tears in that little map that we have, that doesn't always fit into our categorizations of things. And so we have this cross pressure, and Taylor says that this has been building and building, and
so
that
let's imagine that we've listened to this. We've listened to all 5 videos. Maybe we're a member of one of our 2 churches, and we say at the end, this is really interesting. I've never really thought about God this way. I realize that I've been operating with a kind of a Duns Scotus type vision of God, or the consequences of his nominalism, and or univocity of being, I should say. And let's say that you come to this deeper realization, but you also are interacting with people all the time in your life who are operating with the kind of mindset that we've been talking about as being part of the secular age. And you wonder, maybe how can my church be relevant to those people for whom God is so irrelevant? Their whole worldview is shaped by something that says God doesn't matter. What role does the church have to play in all of this? How can we, and not just the church, but individual Christians, how can they be Christian and witness to what we've been talking about today in their relationships with people who are operating with a very different understanding of God and the world?
I mean, one thing is that I think of the scene in the second Lord of the Rings movie, The Two Towers, which the scene is pretty different in the book. And actually, this is one of those cases where I find the cinematic version a little bit more compelling, where Gandalf goes to the great hall of King Theoden of Rohan, and Theoden is under the spell of Saruman, the evil wizard, and by way of a proxy, by way of this advisor in his own court, who is kind of wrapped Theoden up in a web of words that has made him enthralled to Saruman, and Theoden looks like he is an ancient, aged king. You know the scene I'm talking about, right? And I mean, it almost looks like there's like cobwebs hanging off of him, right? I mean, he looks like he's about to keel over at any minute, and he can hardly speak. And Gandalf comes and is able to get to him and throw off his gray cloak to reveal his resplendent vestments, you might say, and bring forth his wizard staff. And he says he recognizes that, in a sense, this is a kind of possession, that Theoden is spellbound by Saruman, and he does a kind of exorcism to break him out from this enchantment, right? And he says, I release you. Well, I think that's the role of the church now, is to say, like, you are under the weight of this enchantment that tells you that life is basically meaningless except for whatever meaning you can muster to apply to it, that it's thin and frail, that it can't speak. You have to give it its words like a ventriloquist, that that it's all just a kind of a fleeting and passing thing. What's the words from Shakespeare? A tale told by an idiot,
full of sound and signifying nothing. Yeah,
signifying nothing. Yeah, and the church's job now, our job, every Christian's job, to the extent that we can, is to say, I release you, to dispel this enchantment of disenchantment, and to remind us once again of the fullness of this creation, because it just is. This cosmos is a creation of a God who is filling it with his grace and glory, that being the only means by which it actually exists. And that there are greater things yet, deeper and behind and beneath all of this that we see.
So part of it then is that, we need to talk about the physical world in a different way with one another. So we need to talk about, let's say, nature, right? As suffused with the grace of God. We need to help people see the vibrancy and fullness and richness of God's presence in and through nature, right? As opposed to seeing it as somehow other than God and separate from God. Again, being careful not to fall into pantheism, which is always, I think, a danger in our time too.
But its existence is suspended from it's upheld by God's grace, by God's
yeah. I mean, avoiding kind of the spatialization otherness, right? That goes with that. the imagining of God as some sort of being out there past, our galaxy, and really changing how we think about church and worship too, because this is I think pretty crucial. Church is often, for many people who have been formed and shaped in this kind of modern view of God, a place where you gather with other Christians to remember the teachings of Jesus, right, and to learn about them, and then to go out and live them out in your life, right, or to engage in sort of moral acts of charity and goodness, and that's the role of the church. Well, what if the role of the church is more to encounter God through the experience of worship and through the experience of the created order? But specifically, let's take the sacraments, right? If we once again see the sacraments as suffused with God's grace and an encounter with the living risen Christ, right? Then worship is this transformative, deeply impactful, kind of almost like the sacralization of that particular time too, of Sunday morning or wherever you gather for worship. Suddenly it takes on a much richer, deeper function than simply being the place you go to be reminded of the moral teachings of Jesus, and participate in some charities or something. It becomes a place of transformation, not downplaying in any way the moral dimension and the Christian life, but seeing that as kind of the fruits of that encounter, right? But that at the heart of the Christian experience at church, or in that space where we gather, through the sacraments, through the proclaimed word too, through the community gathered together, brothers and sisters, is to encounter God in a transformational way. That is a much thicker description of what happens on Sunday morning, right? And what if we were to invite people into that, right? So we're not just saying come to church so that you can, be reminded that you should be nice to people and make some new friends. As wonderful as that is, come to church to experience new, risen, transformed life in God, right? That's a very different thing. And I'm not sure that, the church has always done a good job in our time communicating that profound message.
Yeah, I mean, and here, we need to go back to, so much of our theology, of our liturgy, of our prayers, of our hymns even, are really rooted in this older, more traditional notion of realism in our language, of God in the, as Thomas Aquinas so elegantly described God and God's relationship to creation. This is, right. I mean, there are even hymns by Thomas Aquinas in our hymnal, right? And part of that tradition and part of that language is also to recognize that we live in a fallen world, and that it is, because it's the Shadowlands, because it's not goodness in the perfection of the good,
right,
but only partially and analogously good, or analogically good, I suppose I should say, that there is in fact sin and evil in this creation, and there needs to be things like repentance and forgiveness and that God has not, it's not just that God has loved this whole creation into being, which is true, but that God so loved the world that when it fell into sin and evil, which is not a thing in itself. This is another part of traditional Christian theology, that evil is an absence, a privation of being and the good that deforms what does exist. And what is good, it deforms it, it warps it. And we call this warping or deformation sin, but evil itself has no positive existence. It doesn't exist.
Which again is a kind of way of thinking that fits with that sort of Platonic sense of levels of reality, right? Which is again different kind of how we tend to think. But if you enter into that mindset, you can see how evil would make sense in that context, as opposed to evil being some sort of co-equal causal agent with God in the world, a kind of Manichaeism or something that might emerge.
That's right. I mean, right, and that's often like the misunderstanding that people have, that there's God who's good and he's sitting on one shoulder, and the devil who's bad and he's sitting on one shoulder, and they're both trying to, they're at war with one another, and there's this back and forth, and you've got to choose between the one or the other. So there's three agents. There's God acting for the good and the devil acting for evil, and you can choose to be on the side of the angels, or you can choose to follow the devil or something like that. Again, that's flattened out, right? That's not evil. It has no positive existence. And sin is the warping of reality by this privation, this absence of the good in certain cases. And whenever we turn away from the love of God and the love of neighbor, right? Our eyes, our gaze, the gaze of our souls is to be directed. This is its proper orientation, to be directed in loving adoration of God. And if we put anything else in God's place, even if it's a good thing, like our family or our career or something like that, these are not bad things. Right. Some people do put bad things in place of God. Right. If you're Adolf Hitler, you put Aryan ideal or whatever in place, and that's a bad thing, right? But most of us aren't like that. We put good things in place of God, but these good things, shorn of their connection and participation in God and God's love, have no existence in and of themselves. Right. And therefore, to direct our loving adoration and gaze towards a created thing, not as something that has been, not as a good gift from God, but as something to be fully enjoyed, desired, loved, wanted in and of itself apart from God, right, is to ultimately desire nothing, right, to desire nothingness. And when that happens, that's evil, right? That is, the nothingness is what we call evil. And that desire of something, not as a gift of God, and therefore as something that ultimately draws our hearts further towards the love and adoration of God, which is our source of being, our source of the good, our source of truth, our source of joy, is ultimately to be warped by sin.
And I think what you're getting at here, Nick, of course, is idolatry. And it's interesting that idolatry is, the sin, or the sort of the premier sin that's often mentioned in Scripture, that's at the heart of so many other sins. And I think the reason for that is exactly what you're saying. When you have those disordered loves, your reality is disordered, and you've in some sense given yourself over to nothingness, to the opposite of life, but to a kind of death, right? That's the end of that.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so, I mean, one of the things that we do when we gather for church is we confess that. which again reorients us to the truth, because we don't believe that truth is just what we make it, but
Right.
but the truth, there is truth with a capital T, that when Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, he is identifying himself as the second person of the Trinity, as God himself, as truth.
Right.
And so truth is something real. It has a kind of ontological weight. And all true things, even scientific facts, are true insofar as they participate in, are lent truth by the true, or the truth that is God the Son.
And, you know, we all find ourselves, and this is why we, of course, need our confession of sin and our call to repentance. We all find ourselves regularly falling into these various ways that we can be idolaters, if you will. We're tempted towards that, certainly by our culture. But it's worth remembering, you know, the Greek word for repentance, metanoia, has this sense of taking on a new mind or a new perspective. And I think that's at the heart of what we've been talking about today. So when we say repentance, it's not just, oh, you know, I feel bad that I did X, Y, and Z or whatever, and I shouldn't have done it. But in some sense, you're repenting of a worldview, an idolatry, a misordered or disordered scheme of love that you've fallen into. And you are once again looking at things as they actually are, right? Truth as it actually is, which is to say that sort of thick conception of the cosmos, a sacramental cosmos, one in which God is the heart, the center, that through which all things participate. A world that's that's oriented around that is what we're called to when we say repent. That's metanoia. That's all this other stuff flows from that. But that's the thing that we have to keep coming back to, because we're not, in a sense, encouraged to think of the world that way when we go outside the world. And I'm not even sure that we always do a good job in the church of encouraging people to think about the world that way, right?
That's right. That's right.
And so it's quite natural that we're going to fall into these idolatries and these misconceptions about God and about reality.
And this is something that pervades creation as we know it, which is why God, in fact, does become, the transcendent God does become immanent in the way that, in the traditional way that we might say this, not as in the way that, say, some modern theologians, I think, misunderstand this. God did become immanent. That is, God the Son took on human nature and became the person Jesus Christ. The person Jesus Christ was immanent in the categories of creation in the same way that you and I are, and that all of us are, right? He aged and therefore changed. He felt sorrow. He wept at the grave of Lazarus. This is the impassible God,
Right,
feeling and suffering emotions. This is the immutable God, growing and changing. You know, it's all within his human nature. It's not the divine nature that's doing this, but the teaching of the church is that you can't separate those two in the person of Jesus Christ.
right.
And this life lived fully for the love and to the love of God and of neighbor, and redefining neighbor as enemy, even, because we were all, as St. Paul says, enemies of God. This life is a life that makes metanoia, makes turning, repenting possible, because it is a life that takes on our sinfulness on the cross. Because he becomes sin for us in his crucifixion, and then is raised, and this risen life of Christ, the resurrection, is, in the words of the apostle, a new creation. Paul says it's a new creation. And that new creation, in some sense, that just is this thick reality that undergirds these shadowlands.
Right.
That's the very thing that we're turning towards, is the resurrected reality, the new creation. We call it all sorts of different things to try and get a handle on it.
Right.
The kingdom of God that is in our midst, in a sense.
Right.
But we have to keep turning away from our fixations on the flattened out idols of this world towards that which they should, if they were doing, if we were treating them the way that they were meant to be treated, pointing us to the reality of God.
Could we say, Nick, that in Christ, in his life, death, and resurrection, we see a glimpse, a kind of light bursting forth in the midst of a shadowy darkness, a light of a deeper reality, a light that, as Revelation tells us, will fill all things, right? But we see it sort of breaking into the shadowlands in a particular time, or a particular place, and in a way that's almost an invitation to that deeper reality of what is really the case, right? Kind of, to use Plato's analogy of the cave, like a sort of turning around, right? We've been looking at the cave, and we've been chained, and we're separated, but we still have to go up, out, right? But we've seen the first light in a way, even as we're still in the cave.
And this might be the one difference between the Christian conception and what you find in Plato. Plato says, okay, well, you've got to work at it. Some people aren't smart enough, from Plato's perspective, right? And if they're not, well, too bad. It sucks to be them. But those who have the capacity to do it have to work their way out of the cave, get to the world of reality, apart from the shadows on the wall, see the good, which he identifies as the sun, get a glimpse of that, and then go back down into the cave and try and explain it. And this is just the job of the philosopher. The philosopher keeps, through contemplation, keeps getting up to the reality of the forms, and then going back down to try and describe it, and back and forth and back and forth. And the difference between, and there's something very compelling about that, and there's something very true about that, but there's something that's missing that Christianity recognizes, which is that, in fact, the good itself took human form and came down into the cave to free us.
Right. I mean, one way that I'm sort of visualizing it, if we're going to keep using the cave metaphor, is goodness. The light itself came into the dark cave in Jesus Christ, and in a way, we jumped on Jesus's back, and he's carrying us out of the cave.
Right. That's right.
And it's not us; it's not our work. We're simply on Christ, the light, and he's bringing us to the fullness of light, which is the beatific vision, the eschaton, the new Jerusalem that Revelation talks about.
And more than that, in looking upon the visage of Christ, we can see the good even in the darkness.
Yeah.
And in a sense, when we have shuffled off this mortal coil, then we will be able, I think, still in and through Christ, to see the good, to see God, right? But never apart from Christ. And the difference is, in this life, he has come and made himself present to us, and continues to do so through the sacraments and through the word that's preached. He continues to be present to us, so that a little bit of that new creation, people often misunderstand Thomas Aquinas's view of transubstantiation, which I can't get into here, but essentially he says there's some kind of change that happens, but it's not like any change that we can name in the natural world. There's a change in the essence or the substance of this bread and wine into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, but none of the accounts of changes that we can discuss in terms of the way things change in the natural world makes sense of that. The only thing that it is like is when God created all things in the beginning. And that for him, so the new creation is there in the Eucharist.
Every Sunday.
Every Sunday.
At the Fork Church in Doswell.
Yeah. And at St. Paul's Ivy.
Right. Well, that seems like a good place to end for our fifth video and our recorded videos for this series. Nick, this has been fun thinking about this with you, and we can get into some more of this stuff too. I think there was some really good stuff today when we gather.
Can I say one last thing?
Yeah, one last thing. Yeah.
I love the direction that we went in, and it is a great place to just leave it there. But maybe we can say really quickly that Charles Taylor also talks about this cross pressure creates a nova effect of different new or recombinations of spiritualities. And you see this in the whole movement of people saying I'm spiritual but not religious, not associating with and that's really the world in which we live and move and have our being, is not a world of atheistic kind of this kind of secularization theory that everybody's just going to end up being an atheist and a rationalist in this way. But instead, we live in a world where people, even the people who have no connection to a church, have all sorts of spiritual experiences, encounters, supernatural experiences, encounters, beliefs. There was an article that came out a few years ago that got picked up by several, saying there's more witches in America than Presbyterians. Now, not only works if you count anybody who identifies as a witch, not just Wiccans, and you only count PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA Presbyterians, and not say PC.
Oh, good headline though.
But right, but that's the world we live in, is a world of all sorts of different spiritualities. And I think what we've just been talking about is a more comprehensive and a more beautiful and a more compelling account of reality than anything else that out there, to use a metaphor, in the market, right? Marketplace of ideas. Whether we're talking about atheism or we're talking about one of these new spiritualities. I find, and obviously, right, because I'm wearing a collar, I find this to be the most compelling, the most beautiful, the most, in a good way, enchanting story out there. And the most true.
Right.
And you're here in the stillness, near me, I sense holy sweetness, calling my soul, though it's restless and running, tired soul, though it's restless, till I find my rest in thee. And you're here in the stillness, near me, oh my holy sweetness, calling, holy sweetness, calling. Till I find